Now, first and foremost, before anyone gets it twisted, I'm no fan of communism by any sense of the definition. My only aim here today is to educate you all on how the North Vietnamese army became very successful in their mission to win the war. And I think we can all agree that the sheer fortitude and wisdom of the Viet Cong and the People's Army of Vietnam's forces in combat were a large thorn in the side of the US and South Vietnamese counterinsurgency measures. Now, the communists definitely lost more men in the overall conflict, there's no doubt about that. But with that taken into account, they were still able to win the war, and today I want to take an overall account and look into how they were able to perform such an act, so that we can better understand how the North Vietnamese army were able to keep their momentum to continue fighting and eventually beat their overwhelmingly superior adversary. For starters, the NVA had something that the US and the Army of Republic Vietnam's forces did not. They had the majority support of the rural Vietnamese people. While the US would focus on destroying the enemy, it left little room for actually winning hearts and minds, which is a large component of victory for any long conflict. Humans as a whole are simple. If you're constantly treading on their way of life by killing their family members and destroying their homes, then you automatically lose the support, and the Vietnamese people were no different. While the US was focused on World War II style operations like frontline battle strategies, bombing campaigns, and playing the political figurehead strategy, the NVA made it a priority to go on recruitment campaigns that made very enticing offers by asking rural farmers to simply supply the PAVN and VC forces with food, water, and shelter when needed, never help the Americans, and occasionally go out and fight US and ARVN troops when able, which wasn't hard to ask of the South Vietnamese people who were already opposed to the US occupation soon after the war began, due to them being constantly caught in the crossfire of US fire superiority. They would also accumulate volunteers to leave the village and join mobile VC or PAVN units that would operate in the jungle to go after US and ARVN troops. Recruitment wasn't always so easy, and many times throughout the war, the NVA had to procure supplies and volunteers by force. Just like any other combative force, the guerrilla fighting regiments, known mainly as the Viet Cong, were very concerned with successful operations and unit cohesion. They believed that you could learn from anyone. From the new guy all the way to a seasoned platoon sergeant, all ideas and points of view were valuable. If anyone has ever been in the military, you know this isn't typically the case for large standing armies, which just so happened to give the VC a leg up against the US, who had a very rigid form of military and political hierarchy. After each engagement, the VC units would go over detailed after-action reports and debriefs in what they would call criticism and self-criticism sessions. During these sessions, the NVA strived to find points of friction in individuals as well as in the group. This helped them in the long run by constantly learning from their mistakes, and helped to better improve the insurgency as a whole by sharing successful tactics and ideas to other units. The NVA also strived to prioritize constant rest and refit cycles for their members. Your average NVA troop was reported to only be in a firefight an average of 30 days a year. This helped to reduce failing morale, battle fatigue, and encourage troops to continue to fight as hard as they could when they were ordered to. While they might be forced into an unwanted battle by ARVN or US counterinsurgency actions, most of their time was spent in population control, training, intelligence gathering, propaganda, indoctrination, or construction of fortifications and tunnels. The VC really only came out to fight when they wanted to, which made it difficult for US forces to fight such an elusive enemy. One study even found that 88% of all engagements against US forces were initiated by the enemy. However, when the NVA would go out to attack, they would focus on bleeding their opponent by conducting ambushes. For anyone who knows about the VC, they definitely love their ambushes, having a total of 7 different kinds: mine, bloody nose, flank, L-shaped, maneuver, V-shaped, and Z-shaped. The mine ambush consisted of a controlled detonation explosive that would be triggered by troops hiding nearby. The mine kill zone would usually also have punji pits close by to kill or severely injure US troops who would run from the explosion. The bloody nose ambush would be planned with the goal in mind of having a small unit take on a larger force in order to delay or disrupt them. The NVA would position themselves to enfilade an avenue of approach. As the enemy unit came under fire and attempted to maneuver right or left to close with the ambushers, the booby traps or mines would inflict more casualties. As soon as the NVA element realized that the enemy had taken casualties from the mines and traps, the ambushers then withdrew to another pre-selected site where they might be able to conduct the same or another style of ambush to further degrade the enemy force if they chose to pursue. The flank ambush was one of the simplest to set up and operate, and it was most commonly used by the PAVN forces. The ambush position would lay parallel to a target area, usually a road or small trail, and mines or other traps were placed on the other side of the ambush site. Upon command, the ambushing unit would open fire on the enemy utilizing overlapping positions, and would hope to drive the enemy element into the mines or other traps. After serious damage would be inflicted on the US or ARVN troops, the PAVN forces would then retreat into the opposite direction to avoid a long drawn-out firefight. The L-shaped ambush is an ambush that I've talked about before in one of my older videos, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I do encourage you to check it out. The link will be in the corner. Pretty much an ambush in the shape of an L, with the base and fire in place at the long axis of the road or trail, and the remainder of the assaulting element along the long side of the L. The maneuver ambush was usually directed against road-bound vehicle columns. The NVA usually conducted the ambush from high ground or near a bend in the road, which allowed for cover and long fields of fire for automatic weapons. The ambush was established from positions within 40 yards of the road or less. A road bend was included in the kill zone so that the end of the column was out of sight of the head of the column when the ambush commenced. Interruption of a column's front to rear line of sight increased the likelihood that the head and the tail would split and try to fight separately, effectively dividing the overall strength of the column. The main element would attack the column from the rear or the flank, and the two strikes were timed close enough together so that the target column was forced to engage both ends before it could deploy its force to one side or the other. The V ambush positioned its open mouth towards the enemy patrol and was a favorite amongst the Viet Cong. It was used in both fairly open terrain like rice paddies as well as jungle environments. The V ambush was undetectable by enemy point or flank security until at least a decent portion of the enemy patrol was in the kill zone. The VC would wait until the head of the enemy patrol had passed the opening of the V before opening fire. Enfilading fire using automatic weapons was often directed down the enemy's axis of advance, followed by interlocking fields of fire from each legs of the V. The V ambush also lent itself to the use of controlled mines and booby traps to prohibit troops from retreating out of the kill zone. The Z ambush usually laid along a road and had the goal in mind of being both destructive and confusing to the unit being ambushed. This complicated ambush was usually well planned with low-lying bunkers lining the kill zone and was often prepared months in advance. The ambush position was then occupied only after word was received that the enemy company or battalion-size assets would be using the road that passed through the ambush site. The long end of the Z ambush was located on one side of the road, with the top end of the Z being placed on both sides of the road utilizing automatic weapons. It allowed the ambushers to employ both enfilading and flanking fire. Both ends of the Z were placed to neutralize the enemy's attempt to flank the long end of the Z. Ambushing units deployed along the Z could fire in either direction if the enemy force decided to maneuver through the long axis of the ambush. The Z ambush was dangerous because the ambush elements could easily fire into each other, and that's why they mainly utilized low-lying bunkers to perform this tactic to avoid any blue-on-blue fire. Ambushes were an important part of the PAVN and VC offensive effort, yet not all ambushes were very successful. While the NVA forces typically held the initiative as to where and when to strike, the US mobility and firepower sometimes blunted or decimated their attacks and turned the tables on the NVA, which is why the NVA developed a strategy called hugging. Essentially, the NVA knew that in a matter of minutes after a firefight began, the US would begin to call for fire support on the enemy position. So as a way to stop the US from being able to instantly wipe out their main force, the PAVN and VC made it a priority to get as close as they could to the US forces during a firefight without overexposing themselves. So if the US did call for fire support, it would either miss them completely because the explosives would land behind the pursuing NVA troops, or the US would have to effectively call for a broken arrow, which meant that the US would end up shelling their own position to avoid being overrun by the PAVN or VC forces. This tactic wasn't always extremely successful, as it would cause the NVA to constantly pursue their enemy and possibly force them to run into a baited ambush. In a war of attrition, however, where the clock was running on the US, time favored the communist forces. Manpower losses could also be made up with more infiltration of regulars from the north and additional recruitment of VC from the south. Not only did the NVA employ guerrilla tactics throughout the war, they would also use conventional methods as well when planning to hit large fixed targets like airfields or fire bases, utilizing large assaults in battalion or regimental-sized attacks. Typically, however, the US would be expecting large attacks and would place a large number of obstacles outside the perimeter. Not only were large amounts of barbed wire and makeshift alarms set up, but there were also mines, ramparts, tripwires, and other obstacles to prevent the NVA from raiding the position. This, however, would not save the US and ARVN troops, as the NVA proved to be very resourceful and created sapper forces to mitigate these defensive measures. The sappers would open up holes in the wire for the main NVA force to exploit. The NVA used sappers for a wide range of missions, sometimes by themselves or sometimes as a group to spearhead operations for main forces, as I just stated. The Viet Cong also deployed sappers, particularly after the Tet Offensive casualties had made it very clear that large-scale attacks are obsolete when dealing with the overwhelming fire support the US had at its disposal. Sappers were an elite group, especially adept at infiltrating and attacking airfields, fire bases, and shipyards. About 50,000 men served in the PAVN as sappers and mainly operated as independent cells under orders from regimental or division level. Sappers were trained as radio men, medics, and explosive experts, and became a force economy measure that could deliver a stinging blow utilizing a single member. Many were volunteers and were tasked out to perform coordinated attacks, recon missions, or sabotage. Sappers trained and rehearsed carefully in all aspects of their craft and made use of a variety of equipment and explosive devices, including captured or abandoned American munitions. Sappers also carried out intelligence missions and could work undercover. Sok Mao, who was one of the sappers in the 1968 Tet Offensive attack against the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, for example, was once a taxi driver to the U.S. ambassador of the embassy. Sapper forces played a large role in the success of the North Vietnamese as a whole. Yet probably the largest contributor to the success of the NVA forces had to do with the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Yes, the tactics and specialized units the NVA forces had used against the US and ARVN troops were effective, but it wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for the supply route provided by the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, many people believe that the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a single trail through Laos and Cambodia, but it was actually a large and very sophisticated system of many trails that created access all throughout South Vietnam. From 1961 to 1964, U.S. intelligence analysts estimated that over 50,000 enemy infiltrators had come through South Vietnam using the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The supply capacity of the trail reached 20 to 30 tons per day in 1964, and by 1965, the U.S. command in Saigon estimated that the communist resupply requirements for the Southern forces amounted to 234 tons of all supplies per day, and that 83% of those supplies were moved through the Ho Chi Minh Trail system. Yet U.S. officials had only estimates of their enemy's actual capabilities. Due to improvement of the trail system, the quantity of supplies transferred in 1965 almost equated the combined total for the previous 5 years. During the year, halting operations of the trail system had become one of America's top priorities, but operations against it were complicated by the limited forces available at the time and Laos's claims of neutrality. The intricacies of Laotian affairs and U.S. and North Vietnamese interference with them led to mutual agreements of them all just ignoring each other, at least in the public eye. This, however, did not prevent or even slow down the North Vietnamese from expanding and continuing to use the trail in full view of the Laotian government. U.S. intervention came in the form of building and supporting CIA-backed proxy army units in Laos to fight with the communists, and bombing of the trail began. Operation Barrel Roll, Operation Rolling Thunder, Operation Steel Tiger, and Operation Tiger Hound were all different bombing campaigns that divided up areas of the Ho Chi Minh Trail to be bombed throughout the duration of the war. A common historical perspective supports the efficiency of the campaign, as they did restrict enemy material movement and manpower in Laos and Cambodia. Colonel John Schleit of the U.S. Air Force said of the PAVN's logistical apparatus, "This sustained effort, requiring a full-time activity of tens of thousands of soldiers, who might otherwise have been fighting in South Vietnam, seems proof positive that the bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail had disrupted the North Vietnamese war effort." Despite the U.S. efforts, the estimated number of PAVN infiltrators for 1966 was between 58,000 and 90,000 troops, including 5 full VC regiments. In June 1966, the U.S. credited the North Vietnamese with constructing 600 miles of passable roads within the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and at least 200 miles of which were good enough for year-round use. By the end of 1967, the North Vietnamese had completed an additional 1,800 miles of vehicle-capable roads, including 170 miles of main roads, 358 miles of bypasses, and 280 miles of entry roads and storage areas. This trend of building efficiency continued throughout the war, and in spite of U.S. opposition throughout years of bombing campaigns, by the end of the war, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a total of 10,000 miles. This is an impressive show of determination, and after a 2-decade-long conflict for the North Vietnamese, they finally achieved their victory. Then, swiftly, without hesitation, threw all the South Vietnamese supporters into re-education camps, where they actually were just forced labor camps, and where many died due to exhaustion, starvation, torture, and disease. You know, the typical MO for communists. In closing, the Vietnamese people, as a whole, proved to be very intelligent and ruthless individuals. With all that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.